There's a place in Southeast Asia where the ground still gives back bones, not the bones of soldiers, not the remains of men who chose to fight, who signed their names on dotted lines, who understood in some way that they were stepping into danger. These are the bones of farmers, of children, of grandmothers who had never once held a rifle in their hands. When the sky opened up and the most powerful military force in the history of the world decided that they needed to disappear. This is not a story that America likes to tell. It is not taught in most classrooms. It does not appear prominently in the history books that line the shelves of public schools from California to Maine. No presidential apologies read solemnly into the congressional record. For decades, the operation was classified so deeply that even the pilots who flew the missions were ordered never to speak of what they had done. Some of them went to their graves having told no one. Others broke down years later, confessing to journalists and historians in hushed voices, their hands trembling as they described what they had seen from the cockpit, the villages below, the fires, the silence that followed. The place is Laos. The operation is known, to those who know it at all, as the Secret War. And the numbers are so staggering, so almost incomprehensible in their scale, that when most people hear them for the first time, their first instinct is to assume they must be wrong. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States Air Force dropped more bombs on Laos, a country roughly the size of the United Kingdom, with a population that at the time was around 3 million people, than were dropped on all of Europe combined during the entire Second World War. More than 2 million tons of ordnance, over 500,000 bombing missions. That works out to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 consecutive years. And almost none of it was ever acknowledged. The planes that flew over Laos did not fly under official orders that could be traced back to Washington in any clean, transparent way. The soldiers who fought on the ground were not uniformed American troops. They were recruited locals, hill tribes, men and women paid by the CIA and trained in secret, fighting a war that their own government would later pretend had never happened. The diplomats who negotiated the international agreements that supposedly guaranteed Laotian neutrality. It was a lie built on top of a lie, wrapped in the language of democracy and national security. 700,000 people. That number deserves a moment of silence. It deserves more than that. It deserves the kind of reckoning that history rarely delivers, because history, particularly American history, has a remarkable capacity for looking away from the things that are too painful or too damaging to examine directly. And so the Secret War remained secret, officially and practically, for years after it ended. People who spent years hiding in caves to escape the bombs. People who watched their entire villages obliterated in a single afternoon. Those people kept telling their stories. But no one in the corridors of power in Washington was particularly interested in listening. Not to 1964, when the bombing officially escalated. Not even to the late 1950s, when the CIA first began organizing what would become one of the most elaborate and costly covert operations in the agency's history. You have to go back further to the fundamental logic of the Cold War itself, to the particular brand of American fear that drove policy decisions in Southeast Asia for nearly 3 decades. Fear that was real in some ways and manipulated and distorted in others, but that ultimately provided the justification for actions that, by any reasonable moral standard, constituted crimes against humanity on a massive scale. The Cold War had a geography. It had a map. And on that map, Southeast Asia was one of the most contested and anxiety-producing regions in the world. The triumph of Mao Zedong's Communist Party in China in 1949 had sent shockwaves through Washington. The Korean War, which ended in a bloody stalemate in 1953 after more than 36,000 Americans had died, had demonstrated that the United States was willing to send its sons to die in order, and Vietnam, that long, narrow country on the eastern edge of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, had been smoldering with revolutionary activity since the end of the Second World War. When Ho Chi Minh's forces had fought the Japanese occupation and then turned around and begun fighting the French colonial administration that tried to reimpose its authority, The French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. A humiliation so complete that it effectively ended France's role as a colonial power in Southeast Asia. The Geneva Accords that followed temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And into the vacuum that the French departure created, the United States stepped, cautiously at first, then with increasing commitment, convinced that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. This was the domino theory, and it shaped American foreign policy in the region for a generation. Whether it was right or wrong, strategically speaking, is still debated by historians. What is not debated is the human cost of acting upon it. Laos sat directly to the west of Vietnam. It shared a long, forested, mountainous border with its neighbor. A network of paths and roads and jungle tracks along which North Vietnam moved troops, weapons, food, and equipment south to support the insurgency against the American-backed government in Saigon. That trail was the reason Laos became a target. That trail was the reason 700,000 people died. At least to the military planners who mapped it out in their air-conditioned offices in Washington and Honolulu and Saigon. If you could cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, if you could make it impossible for North Vietnam to supply its forces in the south, you could potentially change the course of the war. You could strangle the Viet Cong insurgency. You could reduce American casualties in the jungles of South Vietnam. You could win. And if doing that required bombing Laos into submission, then that was what you did. You did it quietly, without telling the American public, without telling Congress in any meaningful way. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems, and they compounded each other in ways that the planners had either not anticipated or had anticipated and simply chosen to ignore. These international agreements, signed by 14 nations, including the United States of America, had declared Laos to be a neutral country, not a battleground, not a theater of proxy war, a neutral country, a place that was supposed to be off limits to the military forces of outside powers. It was a fragile, perhaps naive attempt to keep the violence of the Cold War from engulfing a small, largely rural nation that had very little to do with the ideological struggle between Washington and Moscow. The United States had signed those agreements. It had committed on the international stage, in front of the entire world, with its full diplomatic authority, to respecting Laotian neutrality. And then, with no fanfare and no public acknowledgement, it proceeded to bomb the country for 9 consecutive years. The second problem was the nature of the terrain and the population. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through the eastern part of Laos, particularly through a region called the Plain of Jars in the north and the narrow panhandle regions in the south. But Laos was not an empty wilderness. The villages that dotted the landscape of eastern Laos were not military installations. They were not weapons depots or staging grounds for North Vietnamese troops. They were homes, communities, places where children grew up and old people died and families gathered for harvest festivals and weddings. And when American bombs rained down on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, those bombs did not discriminate between a supply truck carrying ammunition and a family gathering for the evening meal. The third problem, and this is perhaps the most damning of all, was that American military and intelligence officials knew this. They knew that the bombing was killing civilians. They had reports, field assessments, intelligence briefings that described the human cost of the campaign in careful, clinical language. And they continued the bombing anyway. Demonstrating American resolve was deemed more important than the lives of the people on the ground. His name was Vang Pao, one of the ethnic minority groups that populated the mountains of northern Laos. The Hmong had a complicated history in Laos. They were not the dominant ethnic group. That was the lowland Lil, who lived in the river valleys and controlled the government and the cities. The Hmong were mountain people with their own distinct language, culture, traditions, and agricultural practices, and they occupied a somewhat marginal position in Laotian society. They were viewed by some lowland Lao with suspicion or condescension, but they were also, as the CIA quickly and correctly recognized, extraordinary fighters. They knew the terrain in a way that no outside force ever could. They were physically tough, resourceful, and deeply committed to their communities. And Vang Pao, who had fought against the French, against the Japanese, against just about every armed force that had moved through his country in the preceding 2 decades, was exactly the kind of leader the agency was looking for. Charismatic, militarily gifted, politically shrewd, and absolutely committed to the cause. The CIA had been operating in Laos since the late 1950s, initially through a program called the Programs Evaluation Office, a deliberately bland, bureaucratic name designed to obscure the fact that it was actually a military assistance program in a country where American military presence was prohibited by international agreement. The agency recruited Hmong fighters, trained them, armed them with American weapons, and organized them into what became known as the Secret Army, a force that at its peak numbered over 30,000 men, fighting a guerrilla war against North Vietnamese forces and the Pathet Lao, the Laotian Communist movement that was ideologically aligned with Hanoi and militarily supported by North Vietnamese troops. Vang Pao was the face of this army. He was the man the CIA worked through. He was the man who recruited fighters from among his own people, who led operations in the mountains, who called in airstrikes, who negotiated with CIA handlers, who delivered military results that the agency found consistently impressive. He believed, or came to believe over time, that the Americans were genuine allies, that the CIA's promises meant something, that the relationship between the Hmong people and the United States government was built on something more solid than temporary strategic convenience. He was wrong about that, but the full extent of that wrongness would not become apparent until later, until after the bombs had fallen and the war had ended and the Americans had left. The mechanics of the secret war were elaborate and, in their own way, almost impressive in the extraordinary lengths to which the American government went to maintain the fiction of plausible deniability. The bombing missions were coordinated through systems specifically designed to keep them off the official books. Pilots who flew missions over Laos were technically classified as flying civilian contractors for organizations with innocent-sounding names, Air America, Continental Air Services, that were, in reality, CIA front operations. If a plane went down and a pilot was captured, there was meant to be no official American military presence to acknowledge. No official prisoner of war status. No official anything. The men who flew those missions were flying as ghosts. The ground operations were handled similarly. CIA officers worked alongside Hmong fighters, advising, coordinating, calling in airstrikes, training soldiers in the use of American weapons. But they did so in civilian clothes, under cover identities, in a country where they were not supposed to be. Some of them were extraordinary individuals, men of genuine courage and ability who believed deeply in what they were doing, who formed real bonds with the Hmong people they worked alongside. Others were more bureaucratic figures, rotating through on short assignments, less personally invested, more focused on their careers and their next posting. The CIA, like any large institution, contained multitudes. The scale of the financial commitment was enormous, billions of dollars over the course of the war, funneled through intelligence budgets. Congress, which under the Constitution was supposed to control the nation's purse strings and have oversight of military operations, was kept largely in the dark. Individual senators and representatives who pressed for information were given carefully constructed half-truths, or were told that for reasons of national security they could not be informed of the details of ongoing operations. This was not a minor bureaucratic irregularity. This was the executive branch of the United States government conducting a major war, a war that involved dropping millions of tons of bombs on a civilian population without the knowledge or meaningful consent of the representatives of the American people. It was, by any honest assessment, a profound violation of the constitutional order. And it was done deliberately, consciously, by intelligent men who knew exactly what they were doing and why. They were doing it because they believed the American public could not be trusted with the truth. That calculation, that the people in positions of power knew better than the citizens they nominally served, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire story, not the bombs. not the body count, not the unexploded ordnance still killing children in Laotian rice paddies 50 years later. The most chilling aspect is the deliberate, systematic decision by American officials to lie to their own country, to construct an elaborate architecture of deception because they believed that the truth was too dangerous to share. And the truth was this: America was fighting a secret war in a neutral country. It was bombing civilian populations who had nothing to do with the conflict. It was killing hundreds of thousands of people who had no say in the matter, who had no voice, who had no way to appeal or protest or make their deaths known to the world. Suggested that the bombing was not achieving its strategic objectives, but because it was the kind of action that powerful institutions engage in once they have started. Because stopping would mean admitting failure. Because the machinery of war, once set in motion, develops its own momentum that is very hard to resist. What did the bombs actually do on the ground? And what actually happened is the gap between strategic theory and human reality. The stated objective, cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was never fully achieved. The trail was not a single road that could be bombed into uselessness. It was a network, a living, adaptive system that the North Vietnamese were constantly repairing, rerouting, reinforcing, and expanding. When a section was destroyed, it was rebuilt. When a bridge was dropped, a ford was found. The North Vietnamese were extraordinarily resourceful, and they had a seemingly inexhaustible supply of labor, both military and civilian, to keep the trail functioning. By most serious military assessments, even classified ones, the bombing delayed North Vietnamese supply movements but never stopped them. The supplies kept flowing. The war in Vietnam continued. The Americans and their allies kept dying. And in Laos, the civilians kept dying too. What the bombing did accomplish, with devastating and terrible efficiency, was the destruction of the civilian landscape of eastern and northern Laos. The Plain of Jars, a vast, beautiful plateau in the mountains of northern Laos, named for the hundreds of enormous ancient stone jars that dot its surface. Enigmatic relics of a civilization we know almost nothing about. Artifacts that archaeologists were only beginning to seriously study when the bombing began. This entire region was essentially obliterated. Villages that had existed for centuries were reduced to rubble. The agricultural system that had sustained the local population for generations was shattered. Rice paddies were cratered. Irrigation systems that represented centuries of careful engineering were destroyed. Livestock was killed. Granaries were burned. Markets were bombed. Hospitals were bombed. Schools were bombed. Buddhist temples, some of them hundreds of years old, centers of spiritual and cultural life for entire communities, were bombed. And the people, the farmers, the families, the communities, fled. Or they died. Or they went underground, literally, digging shelters in the sides of hills and mountains, spending years living in caves and in the jungle, emerging only at night to tend their crops when the bombers were less likely to be overhead. Families lived in rock overhangs and cave systems for years at a time. Children were born underground. Old people died underground. An entire generation of Laotians grew up knowing the sound of bombers before they knew the sound of birds. And aid workers who went to Laos after the war ended and began patiently, carefully interviewing survivors. The testimonies they collected are extraordinary in their detail and their horror. Individual voices of specific individual human beings describing what they lived through. People describing watching entire villages disappear in a matter of minutes. The way the sound of the bombs seemed to come from everywhere at once. The way the smoke rose in columns against the blue sky. The way silence descended afterward. A silence that felt wrong because it was the silence of absence, of things that had been there and were no longer. Children who grew up during the bombing years talking about what it was like to learn to distinguish between different kinds of aircraft by their sound. To know that certain sounds meant you had seconds to run, others meant you had minutes, others meant the bombs would fall far enough away that you might survive. Children describing the particular terror of clear days when the bombers could see their targets. Describing the strange, brief relief of rainy season when clouds sometimes kept the planes away. Farmers describing what it was like to return to their fields, or to what had been their fields after a bombing run. Finding craters where crops had been, finding dead animals, finding fragments of things that had been buildings, finding nothing at all. Just earth and silence and the specific quality of emptiness that bomb damage creates, an emptiness that is different from natural emptiness because you know what it replaced. One woman, interviewed by researchers in the 1990s, described watching her village be destroyed from a hillside where she had fled with her children when she heard the approaching aircraft. She described the sound first, a low rumbling that she initially mistook for distant thunder, the way the sky sometimes rumbled before the monsoon rains came. Then she saw the planes, tiny silver shapes moving high and fast across the blue sky, and she knew what they were, and she ran. She ran with her children, pulling the youngest by the hand, toward the tree line, toward any cover she could find. And from the edge of the jungle she watched. She described the bombs falling as looking, strangely, almost beautiful from a distance. The way they tumbled end over end in the air before impact. The way the explosions walked across the valley floor in a line, one after another, each explosion chasing the last. She described the sound reaching her a second after each explosion, the ground shaking under her feet, her children crying, pressing their faces into her body. She described watching the house where she had been born, where her mother had been born, where her grandmother had sat in the evenings shelling rice and telling stories, disappear in a column of smoke and fire that rose into the afternoon sky and drifted slowly to the east. That woman was not a soldier. She was not, in any meaningful sense, a threat to American national security. She was a rice farmer. She was a mother. She was a person whose life had value, whose home had value, whose community had value, whose history and culture and way of life had value. And she lost all of it because her village happened to be in the vicinity of a supply route that American military planners had decided needed to be bombed. Between 1964 and 1973, American aircraft dropped approximately 270 million cluster bombs on Laos. 270 million. These were not single bombs. Each cluster bomb was a canister that opened in midair and scattered dozens or hundreds of smaller submunitions, sometimes called bommies by the Laotian people, across a wide area. They were designed to shred anything living within their blast radius. They were highly effective at killing people. They were less effective at distinguishing between North Vietnamese soldiers on the trail and Hmong farmers in their fields. It is estimated that somewhere between 30 and 40% of these cluster submunitions failed to explode on impact. The soil conditions, the vegetation, the angle of impact, the age and condition of the munitions, any of these factors could cause a bomblet to bury itself in the earth without detonating. To lie dormant, waiting. A live bomblet is roughly the size and shape of a tennis ball. It is often, due to rust and weathering, a reddish-orange color that can attract the attention of children. It contains enough explosive force to kill or severely injure anyone within a radius of several meters. More than 80 million unexploded submunitions remain in Laotian soil today. 80 million. They are scattered across approximately a quarter of the country's total land area. They are in the fields where farmers grow their rice, their vegetables, their cassava. They are buried in the banks of rivers. They are hidden in the soil of schoolyards. They fall out of eroding hillsides after heavy rains. They surface when land is cleared for new construction. They are picked up by children who have never been taught to recognize them, or who were taught but forgot, or who recognized them and were simply unlucky. Since the end of the war, more than 20,000 people have been killed or injured by unexploded ordnance in Laos. More than 20,000. And this number continues to grow year by year as farmers clear new land, as construction projects break ground, as the slow movements of soil and water continue to bring buried ordnance to the surface. Roughly half of all UXO casualties are children. Children whose parents survived the war, whose grandparents survived the bombing, who were born into a peacetime country that was nevertheless still being killed by a war that ended before they were born. The economic devastation is equally profound, if less dramatic. Vast areas of potentially productive agricultural land cannot be safely farmed because of the UXO contamination. In a country where agriculture is the primary economic activity for the majority of the population, this represents a crippling constraint on development. Communities that might have used their land to generate income, to educate their children, to build infrastructure, are instead trapped in poverty partly because the land is too dangerous to fully use. The connection is direct and traceable. Decisions made in Washington in the 1960s are still shaping the life chances of Laotian children today. The Hmong people deserve their own accounting in this history, because their story is in some ways the most intimate and the most painful dimension of the Secret War's legacy. The CIA had not merely used the Hmong as soldiers. It had, over more than a decade, built an entire relationship, political, military, personal, around the Hmong community. CIA officers had lived alongside Hmong families in the mountains. They had attended weddings and funerals. They had learned the language. Some of them had formed genuine friendships, genuine bonds. And Vang Pao, as the leader of the Hmong military effort, had staked everything, his reputation, his people's resources, his vision of the future, on the belief that America would not abandon its allies. When the American political will to continue the war in Vietnam collapsed in the early 1970s, when the domestic opposition became too great to overcome, when Congress began restricting funding, when the Nixon administration began negotiating the withdrawal, the CIA's priorities shifted. Getting American personnel out was paramount. Maintaining the secret army, honoring the commitments that had been made to the Hmong, was secondary. And then, as the communist forces consolidated their control over Laos following the broader regional communist victories of 1975, it became not secondary but negligible. The evacuation of Vang Pao himself was carried out. He was flown out by CIA aircraft, eventually resettling in the United States, and that action became, in retrospect, a symbol of the limits of American commitment. The general was saved. His people, by and large, were not. Tens of thousands of Hmong fighters and their families were left behind in a country now controlled by a government that regarded them as traitors and enemies. What followed was violent, chaotic, and traumatic. Hmong communities that had been armed and encouraged by the CIA found themselves suddenly without support, without resources, facing retribution from the forces they had been fighting. Thousands crossed the Mekong River into Thailand, carrying what they could, leaving behind everything else. The Thai refugee camps where they were resettled were not designed as permanent accommodation, but many people stayed in them for years, sometimes decades, waiting for the opportunity to resettle permanently elsewhere. Some eventually made it to the United States, to France, to Australia, to other countries willing to accept them. Others remained in the camps for years. Others went back into the Laotian jungle, where some Hmong resistance groups continued to operate for years after the official end of the war, hunted by government forces, slowly dying out. The Hmong communities that settled in the United States, concentrated particularly in California and Minnesota, carried with them not just the trauma of the war and the displacement, but a specific and profound sense of betrayal. They had fought. They had sacrificed. They had done what the CIA had asked them to do. And they had been abandoned when their usefulness was exhausted. That sense of betrayal has not faded with time. It has been passed down to younger generations. It shapes the way Hmong Americans understand their history and their relationship with the American government. The journalists who began uncovering the secret war in the late 1960s were operating in a climate of official hostility that is hard to fully appreciate from the present. The Vietnam War had already generated enormous domestic controversy. The Pentagon Papers leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971 had revealed systematic deception in American Vietnam policy. But Laos was, in many ways, even more sensitive than Vietnam, precisely because the deception there was so complete, the gap between official statements and actual actions so enormous. T.D. Ullman, whose early reporting for the Far Eastern Economic Review helped break the story open, described the difficulty of working in Laos in that period. The official American line was maintained with remarkable consistency. Embassy spokespeople denied things that were visibly happening. Officials who spoke off the record made clear that the consequences of breaking the story would be severe. And many of the witnesses who could confirm what was happening, the pilots, the CIA officers, the military advisors, were bound by secrecy, oaths, and genuinely believed that speaking out would put ongoing operations and human lives at risk. It was Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri who did more than almost anyone else in Washington to force the truth into the public record. Using his position on the Senate Armed Services Committee, Symington conducted a series of hearings in 1969 and 1970 that, even in their heavily redacted public versions, revealed the basic outlines of what was happening. The classified transcripts of those hearings, which remained sealed for decades, were eventually released and showed that Symington had pressed administration officials relentlessly that he had asked the right questions, that he had refused to accept evasions, and that the officials who appeared before him had lied or misled him with a consistency and fluency that suggested extensive practice. What Symington and the journalists and the historians who followed them were doing was a form of moral archaeology, digging through layers of official denial to find the truth that lay underneath. It was slow work. It was frequently obstructed. And its results, when they came, were often received with a kind of numbed recognition by a public that had already processed so much disillusionment about Vietnam that the revelations about Laos seemed to represent more of the same, rather than a distinct and additional moral reckoning. This is one of the ways that sustained official deception does lasting damage, not just in the immediate concealment of specific truths, but in the broader corrosion of public trust, the gradual erosion of citizens' ability to believe anything their government tells them. The lies about Laos were not just lies about Laos. They were part of a pattern of deception that, once recognized, called into question everything. And the cynicism that produced, while perhaps rational, had its own costs that are still being paid in the form of a public that has enormous difficulty distinguishing between legitimate government secrecy and illegitimate deception. The legal dimensions of the secret war have never been fully examined in any official forum. No American official has ever been prosecuted or even formally charged in connection with the deaths of civilians in Laos. The closest thing to official accountability that occurred were the Senate hearings, which produced recommendations for greater congressional oversight of intelligence operations, recommendations that were partially implemented in the Church Committee investigations of the mid-1970s and the intelligence oversight mechanisms that followed. But oversight reform, however valuable, is not accountability for specific actions. It is a structural response, not a moral one. The principle of proportionality in the laws of war, the requirement that harm to civilians be proportionate to military advantage gained, was, by any honest assessment, catastrophically violated in Laos. The military advantage gained from the bombing campaign was limited and temporary. The harm caused to civilians was enormous, lasting, and in the case of unexploded ordnance, literally permanent. By the standards that international law articulates, and that the United States itself helped write after World War II, what happened in Laos was not a close case. It was a clear and documented violation. That the men who made the decisions, who sat in rooms in Washington and signed the orders and approved the budgets and reviewed the intelligence assessments and continued the bombing year after year after year, that those men retired with honors and were buried with military ceremony and had their names placed on government buildings and were celebrated as statesmen and public servants, is itself a statement. A statement about how accountability works when the people being held accountable are powerful enough to write their own history. A statement about the distance between the ideals that democracies proclaim and the realities they are willing to confront. The Plain of Jars today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This recognition, granted in 2019, was not for the bombing, it was for those ancient stone jars, those thousands of years old artifacts of a civilization that we still cannot fully explain. Tourists come to see them now. They walk across a landscape that is still even today, riddled with unexploded ordnance. The clearance teams that work the area mark safe paths and safe zones, and visitors are advised to stay within them. The jars themselves sit in their craters and on their hillsides as they have for millennia, patient and massive and utterly indifferent to the human violence that has swirled around them. It is a strange and dissonant kind of place. The beauty of the landscape, the rolling plateau, the enormous jars casting long shadows in the evening light, the mountains rising in the distance, coexists with the knowledge of what happened here. It coexists with the small signs that UXO clearance teams place in the grass to mark where bombs have been found and removed, and with the unspoken understanding that there are far more bombs in this ground than have yet been found. Progress is being made. Organizations like the Mines Advisory Group, the Halo Trust, and the UXO Laos National Clearance Authority work steadily, year after year, removing ordnance from the ground. American funding for clearance operations has increased significantly since President Obama's visit in 2016. The work is slow and dangerous. Clearance teams operate under constant risk, and casualties among clearance workers are a regular occurrence. But the work continues. At current rates of clearance, it will take roughly 100 years to clear all the ordnance from affected areas. 100 years. That means that the consequences of decisions made in Washington in the 1960s will continue to kill people in Laos until the 22nd century. Children not yet born will die because of those decisions. The line of causality stretches forward into a future that the men who made those decisions could not see, or chose not to see. There are former American military personnel who have returned to Laos in the decades since the war. Some have worked with clearance teams. Some have participated in projects to document the history of the air campaign. Some have sat with survivors and listened to their stories. The motivations are varied: guilt, a sense of moral obligation, simple human curiosity about the places and people they touched in their youth, a desire to close a chapter that never fully closed. None of these visits can undo what was done. None of them can give back a life or a home or a community. But they are a form of acknowledgement, a recognition that the people of Laos were real people who mattered. And sometimes that acknowledgement, while not enough, is something. Chanafa Kambangsa was born in Laos and came to the United States as a refugee. She grew up carrying with her the knowledge of what had happened to her country. And as an adult, she founded Legacies of War, an advocacy organization dedicated to raising awareness of the UXO crisis and pushing for greater American commitment to clearance operations. Her work, and the work of countless others in the Laotian American community and in the broader human rights community, has been essential in keeping this story alive, ensuring that it does not simply fade away into the comfortable fog of historical forgetting. The story of Laos is, in part, a story about what happens when power is exercised without accountability, when violence is concealed behind secrecy, when the people making decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions. It is a story that is specific in its details and universal in its implications. Every government that has ever conducted covert military operations, every administration that has ever decided that the public could not be trusted with certain kinds of truth, every official who has ever concluded that strategic necessity overrides the right of innocent people not to be bombed. Every one of these shares something with the people who made the decisions about Laos. That does not mean all such decisions are equivalent. It does not mean that covert operations are always wrong, or that national security never justifies secrecy, or that the moral calculus of war is simple. But it does mean that the specific pattern of what happened in Laos, the denial, the concealment, the scale of civilian casualties, the abandonment of allies, the decades of inadequate response, that pattern demands examination. It demands the kind of honest, unflinching examination that powerful institutions are almost never willing to apply to themselves. But that history, in the end, applies anyway, because that is what history does. Eventually, the bones keep coming out of the ground in Laos. Farmers working their fields turn up fragments of metal, remnants of ordnance, sometimes human remains. The land itself has not forgotten. The land is still testifying in its slow geological way to what was done to it. And the people, the survivors, the refugees, the diaspora communities scattered across America and France and Australia and beyond, those people have not forgotten either. They carry the memory. They pass it to their children. They keep the story alive even when official histories would prefer to let it disappear. 700,000 people erased from the story that America told about itself during the Cold War. 700,000 lives given less weight than the strategic calculations of men in offices 10,000 miles away. 700,000 deaths that are real, specific, individual, each one a world that ended too soon and for reasons that had nothing to do with anything that person had done or failed to do. Their names are mostly unknown. Their faces are mostly unseen. The historical record has preserved very little of who they were, the particular way a grandmother held her grandchildren, the specific songs that were sung at harvest festivals in villages that no longer exist, the jokes and arguments and ordinary human texture of lives that were simply stopped. That loss, the loss of the irreplaceable, the ordinary, the human, is perhaps the deepest loss of all. History can record the numbers. It can analyze the strategy. It can document the deception and assess the legal violations and trace the political consequences. But it cannot give back what was taken. It cannot restore the plain of jars to what it was before the bombs fell. It cannot return the children who died to the parents who lost them. What history can do, what we can do, by insisting on knowing and telling the full truth of what happened, is ensure that these lives are not simply forgotten, that they are not erased a second time by silence and inattention after having been erased a first time by bombs and official denial, that the 700,000 become, in however partial and inadequate a way, visible, known, acknowledged, mourned. The secret war in Laos was kept secret for a reason. It was kept secret because the people waging it knew, at some level, that it could not survive honest scrutiny. Because the logic that animated it, that some lives matter less than others, that civilian casualties are an acceptable cost when strategic interests are at stake, that citizens cannot be trusted with the truth about what their government does in their name is a logic that, stated plainly in public, in the light of day, most people would reject. Most people, given the chance to consider it honestly, would say no, would say that those farmers and children and grandmothers mattered, would say that their lives were worth more than the minimal military advantage gained by bombing their villages, would say that the promises made to the Hmong people should have been kept, would say that the truth should have been told, even at political cost. Most people, given the chance, would choose differently. The secret war is over. But the ground is still giving back bones, and that means the reckoning is not over either. It is just beginning. Think about what it means to erase a war from history. Not to lose it. Not to be defeated and forced to acknowledge defeat. But to actively, deliberately, systematically choose to pretend it did not happen. To create the bureaucratic machinery of forgetting, the classified documents, the cover stories, the signed agreements casually violated, the senators politely misled, the press conferences where official spokespeople denied things that were happening in real time, that they knew were happening, that they had authorized to happen. That machinery required effort. It required coordination. It required, in some meaningful sense, a collective choice by a significant number of people in positions of authority that this was acceptable, that the war could be hidden, that the dead would stay hidden with it, that Laos was far enough away, poor enough, powerless enough, that what happened there would not matter. That calculation was not entirely wrong for a long time. For decades it held. The official history moved on. The Vietnam War became the subject of endless examination, the central moral trauma of a generation of American foreign policy. Films were made, books were written, monuments were built, arguments were had about meaning and responsibility and who bore what share of the guilt for what went wrong. All of that was necessary and important. And yet, just to the west, across the Mekong, the larger war, measured by bomb tonnage, measured by civilian deaths, measured by the contamination of the landscape, went largely unexamined, a footnote to someone else's argument. The survivors did not experience it as a footnote. The Hmong men who had fought for a decade in the mountains of northern Laos, who had watched their comrades die in firefights and in bombing runs and in ambushes, who had seen their villages destroyed and their families scattered across the jungle, those men did not experience their war as a footnote to the American experience of Vietnam. They experienced it as their whole world, as everything that had happened to them, as the thing that had unmade their lives and remade them in forms they had not chosen. When these men eventually arrived in the United States in the refugee processing centers in Thailand, on the planes that carried them to California and Minnesota and Wisconsin, in the apartments and houses and communities they built in American cities and towns, they brought with them a history that had no place in the country they had arrived in, a history that most of their American neighbors had never heard of, a history that the official American narrative had, for the most part, erased. Learning to exist alongside this erasure is itself a form of labor, a constant low-grade effort that the Hmong diaspora has had to perform for decades. The effort of maintaining your own history against the indifference of the dominant culture. The effort of telling your children what happened, knowing that when those children go to school, they will encounter textbooks that do not mention it, teachers who have never heard of it, classmates for whom the whole experience is incomprehensible. The effort of remaining visible when the forces of official history conspire toward your invisibility. This effort has not been entirely unsuccessful. The Hmong community in the United States has produced writers and artists and activists and politicians who have worked to bring this history into the mainstream of American public consciousness. The oral histories collected by researchers and community organizations represent a significant archive of testimony about what the war was like from the inside, from the people who lived it rather than the people who directed it from a distance. These resources exist. They are not always easy to find or access, but they exist. And the broader historical record on the secret war has grown considerably richer in the decades since the war ended. The declassification of documents, the opening of archives, the death of officials who had maintained secrecy during their lifetimes, and whose papers were then examined by historians. All of these processes have produced a much more detailed and documented account of what happened and why. The basic facts of the war are no longer in serious dispute among historians. The debate now is about interpretation, about how to weight different factors, about where moral responsibility lies most heavily, about what conclusions to draw for American foreign policy. That debate is important. But it is also, in some sense, a luxury. It is a debate that takes place in academic journals and think tanks and foreign policy forums, among people who have the education and the institutional access to engage with that kind of discourse. The farmers of Laos who are still dealing with unexploded ordnance in their fields are not waiting for the foreign policy debate to reach its conclusions. They are dealing with the consequences of decisions that were made before they were born, that they had no part in making and that have shaped their lives in ways they did not choose. The concrete daily reality of living in a country contaminated by unexploded ordnance is difficult to convey to people who have not experienced it. It means that every time you want to clear new land for farming, you face a risk calculation. It means that your children's freedom of movement is constrained in ways that children in other countries do not experience. It means that development is slower, infrastructure is harder to build, poverty is more intractable than it would otherwise be. It means that the random deaths continue, not the mass deaths of the war years, but the individual, preventable deaths that happen one by one, when someone picks something up that they should not have picked up, or steps in the wrong place, or is simply unlucky. Clearance technology has improved significantly since the early years of UXO removal work in Laos. Ground-penetrating radar, improved metal detectors, better protective equipment for clearance workers. These advances have made the work both faster and safer than it used to be. International investment in clearance has increased. The commitment of the Laotian government to addressing the UXO problem, while constrained by the country's limited resources, is genuine. The work is happening. But the scale of the problem means that even with all of these improvements, even with increased international funding, even with the best technology currently available, the timeline for fully clearing the contaminated areas stretches across generations. This is not a problem that the current generation can solve. It is a problem that will be passed to their children and their children's children, along with the history of how it came to exist in the first place. There is a concept in moral philosophy sometimes called structural injustice. Injustice that is embedded not in individual acts of wrongdoing, but in the broader systems and institutions and historical patterns that shape people's life chances. Laos's UXO problem is, among other things, an example of structural injustice in a very literal and material form. The injustice is physically present in the soil. It is there every day, and it will be there every day for generations to come. And its origins lie in specific decisions made by specific people who never faced meaningful accountability for those decisions. Acknowledging structural injustice does not require believing that everything is equally wrong or that all historical actors are equally culpable. It does require believing that history matters, that the past shapes the present in ways that are real and concrete, and that cannot simply be wished away or declared over because a peace treaty was signed or a war ended. It requires accepting that the American bombing of Laos is not simply history, it is ongoing. Its consequences are ongoing. The people being killed by unexploded ordnance today are being killed by the secret war, as surely as if the bombs were falling now. The secret war in Laos is, in the end, a story about power. About the power of the state to conduct violence in secret. About the power of institutions to resist accountability. About the power of distance, geographic, cultural, economic, to determine whose deaths register and whose do not. About the power of official narrative to shape what is remembered and what is forgotten. But it is also a story about the limits of that power, because the secret came out. Not immediately, not completely, not with the force that would have been required to produce real accountability, but it came out. The survivors talked. The journalists reported, the historians documented, the Hmong diaspora preserved, the bones in the ground testified, and the story, however slowly, however inadequately, is being told. This telling matters. Not because it changes the past, nothing changes the past, but because how we understand the past shapes how we understand ourselves, and how we understand ourselves shapes what we do. A country that fully reckons with what happened in Laos, that looks at those 700,000 civilian deaths without flinching, that asks honestly how they were permitted to happen and what they reveal about the structures of American power and accountability. That country is better equipped to avoid similar choices in the future, not guaranteed to avoid them. Better equipped. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is not the kind of redemptive ending that stories about historical atrocity sometimes try to find, the discovery that everything worked out in the end, that justice was done, that the dead did not die in vain. The dead did die in vain, in the most literal sense. The military objectives that their deaths were meant to serve were not achieved. The war in Vietnam was lost. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was never cut. Everything that was sacrificed to the bombing campaign, including 700,000 civilian lives, was sacrificed for nothing. It is almost unbearable to sit with. It is the kind of conclusion that makes you want to find something redemptive, something that gives the deaths meaning, something that transforms catastrophe into lesson. The only honest lesson is this: it happened. It was done by people who believed they were acting rationally and in service of important goals. It was concealed by people who believed that concealment was justified by those same goals. And it killed hundreds of thousands of people who had done nothing to deserve it, and contaminated a landscape that is still killing people today, and scattered a community across the world, and produced no meaningful accountability for anyone responsible. That is the history. It is uncomfortable. It does not resolve neatly. It does not offer the satisfaction of villains punished or victims vindicated. It offers only the truth, which is sometimes all that history has to give, and the truth is enough. The truth, told clearly, without flinching, to anyone willing to hear it, is the only thing that has ever, in any case, in any historical atrocity, prevented the next one. The ground in Laos is still giving back bones, and the least we can do is know whose bones they are, and why they are there, and who put them there, and refuse to look away. There is a particular kind of courage required to look honestly at your own country's history, not the courage of soldiers or explorers or people facing physical danger. A different kind, the courage to sit with discomfort, the courage to resist the pull of national pride when that pride is being used to obscure rather than illuminate, the courage to say, about the country you love, the country that has given you things worth being grateful for, that something terrible was done in its name and that the terribleness matters and must be confronted. Americans who engage seriously with the history of Laos often describe something like grief. A grief that is mixed with anger and with guilt and with a complicated love for a country capable of both enormous generosity and enormous cruelty. That grief is appropriate. It is the right emotional response. And it is the beginning of something better than either denial or despair. Denial says this didn't happen, or it wasn't that bad, or it was necessary, or the people who suffered somehow deserved it, or history is too complex for moral judgment. Denial is comfortable. It requires nothing of the person who chooses it. Despair says, this is what America is. This is what power always does. Nothing changes. Accountability is a fiction. The powerful always escape. Despair is also comfortable in its own way, because it absolves you of the responsibility to try. What the history of Laos demands is neither denial nor despair. It demands something harder. It demands the work of reckoning, looking clearly, understanding fully, acknowledging responsibility without qualification or escape, and then doing something with that acknowledgement, clearing more bombs, funding more research, teaching the history more honestly, building the political will to ensure that when similar decisions are being contemplated somewhere in the bureaucracies of powerful states, as they always are, there are more voices willing to say no. Willing to say that the lives on the other end of those bombs have value. That strategic necessity is not a blank check drawn against the lives of people who have no power to resist. The Laotian people did not choose to be in the way of the Vietnam War. They did not choose to live along routes that American military planners decided needed to be bombed. They did not choose to have their villages destroyed, their communities scattered, and their land contaminated for generations. These things were done to them by people who had the power to do them and the will to hide what they had done. And yet they are still here, still farming, still building, still teaching their children, still clearing bombs from their fields, one by one, year after year, with a patience and a resilience that should humble anyone who encounters it. Still living on land that was bombed and that still, half a century later, kills some of them every single year. They deserve better than to become a forgotten footnote in someone else's war. They deserve the full truth of what happened to them, told plainly, in every language, in every classroom, in every forum where the history of American power is examined and debated. They deserve, after everything, to be seen. The bombers are long gone from the sky above Laos. The jungle has reclaimed much of what was destroyed. New generations have grown up in villages rebuilt from the rubble of older ones. Children go to school, fall in love, plant rice, raise families. Life, as it always does, continues, but the ground remembers. The ground holds the record that official history tried to erase. Every fragment of metal that surfaces in a field, every unexploded submunition that a clearance team gently extracts from the earth, every bone that emerges after heavy rain, all of it is testimony. All of it is the past refusing to stay buried. 700,000 lives, erased from the story America told about itself. Erased from the history books and the congressional debates and the official accounts of a war that, by the measures that mattered to the people making the decisions, was already lost. They were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were people, specific, irreplaceable, individual human beings who had names and histories and people, who loved them and futures they were building and will never get to live. They were in the way, and that was enough. History will not let that be the end of their story. Not while there are people willing to look. Not while the ground keeps giving back its evidence. Not while survivors tell their children, and those children tell their children, and the chain of testimony stretches forward into a future that the bombs were meant to silence forever. The secret war is over. The reckoning has barely begun, and the ground in Laos is still giving back bones.